Thanks very much, Dory, for that introduction, a very kind introduction. And thanks very much for this honor. When I got the email from Cheryl saying that they wanted whether I was interested in being a distinguished alumnus, and I said, of course I am, of this wonderful institution, but I also said, Cheryl, I suspect you didn't check with your father-in-law, who was my faculty advisor, because I was not a distinguished student, I will say. But she said something nice like, well, some people are late bloomers or something like that. But these were significant years for me at Canadian Mennonite Bible College across the street here. I felt like this was a very tight and supportive community that bound together. And the word community was often on our lips as we talked about this experience that we were having at the school. The school at the time was relatively small compared to what it was now. It was maybe 150, 200 people who lived on campus, or mostly lived on campus. And because of that small size, we had this tight feeling, and we were all doing very much the same things, taking the same classes with the same professors. Many of us lived in almost identical dorm rooms in the dorm. Many of us ate the same meals in the cafeteria day after day, and we shared a lot of common experiences. And of course, on an almost daily basis, we sung together and prayed together in the pre-lunch chapel time, which was always a wonderful time for me. For me, it felt like a really good place to be. But of course, there were little disruptions in this utopian existence that we had here at 600 Shaftesbury. There were those who perhaps didn't get around to doing their cleaning of the toilet, or not up to the standards that some people would think. Or there were always those pesky professors who seemed to think that we had to read lots and lots and lots of pages every night and be able to understand them the next day. But there was also these periodic intrusions into our life when visitors would come onto the campus and be in the community, and they would be there for attending meetings or something like that. And there was always the major disruption in January when you would have pastors from all across Canada coming to take classes for a week. And really, there was nothing so disconcerting about a bunch of pastors away from their congregation for a week. It was really rattling to us. I confess that I wasn't always particularly welcoming to visitors, those of us there as students. And I do remember faculty and staff chiding us to try and be a little more welcoming to visitors. But in fact, we had kind of a derogatory term for the visitors while we were there. We called them Zens. Now, we called them Zens not because they had this peaceful air about them in terms of Zen Buddhism. We called them Zens because that's the Greek word for stranger. Now, actually, if we'd been paying attention in Peter Fast's Greek class, we would know that that actually isn't the Greek word for stranger. The Greek word for stranger is a masculine noun, and so it would be, anyone? Some of you, I think, will have to stay after class. Xenos is the Greek word, and the plural would be? Xenoi? Good. Very good. Well, I think you've redeemed yourself. That's more Greek than I've done in quite a while. I think we were polite enough to these visitors, but I wouldn't say that we were rude necessarily, and I wouldn't say that we were xenophobic, but neither would I say that we were xenophilic. So how did I get there? How did I get where I am today? How did I get from this warm and somewhat insular community at 600 Shaftesbury Boulevard to being somebody who's considered an expert on integration and refugee sponsorship in Canada? Well, it was by accident, really. I didn't plan this. One could even say it was providence, but that's a different school here in Manitoba, so we won't be talking about that. I think it started maybe with me getting a job at MCC Canada shortly after returning from our 6 wonderful years in South Africa that Dory talked about, where we were definitely outsiders. Or perhaps maybe it was actually when we were in South Africa being mission workers there, where we were definitely outsiders and where we had friends who were from a completely different culture from us. And in our interactions with them on a daily basis, as we talked about everyday things, or we talked about how we understand God, or how God works in the world, or how we understand the Bible. It made me realize that people there saw things very differently than I did in some ways. And as we talked, I think I had a better understanding of my own culture and who I was. And I think that was a very important experience for me in terms of thinking about where I am today. Well, back to MCC. One day, when I was finishing a one-term maternity leave position, it wasn't my maternity, it was somebody else's, I was walking down the hall, and the executive director for MCC Manitoba, Peter Rempel, was passing me, and he said, I noticed your term is finishing. Are you busy? And I said, no, I don't really have anything lined up after my job here. And he said, well, that's good, because the person who does the refugee program for MCC Manitoba has unfortunately gone on a medical leave, and we don't know how long she's going to be out. So you understand our antiquated email system, and perhaps you could just sit at the desk there and make sure that the email box doesn't get too full. And I sure I could do that. So I did that for a few weeks, and then a few weeks turned into a few months, and then a few months turned into a few years. And it became apparent that my colleague was not going to be returning, and she went on long-term disability. So at a certain point, they said, well, you're still here. Do you want the job? And I said, okay. So there I was in a job that I had never really interviewed for, and I'm still there. Now, the first few years, we weren't that particularly busy in the refugee program. And some days, actually, I wondered whether I had enough work to do there. So I began to think about leadership roles. And so, as Dory was talking about, I was nominated to be on the Sponsorship Agreement Holder Association, the SAW Association. And that, as Dory said, has taken me a lot of places, often to Ottawa to meet with government officials or other NGOs, and even to Europe, in Geneva and other places in Europe, to talk about Canada's sponsorship program. About 3 years ago, things changed dramatically. About 3 years ago, in fact, this month, when an image of a young boy who had died trying to cross the Mediterranean appeared on the internet. And all of a sudden, people all across Canada, and indeed around the world, wanted to do something about that. And so we at Mennonite Central Committee were inundated. We went from a very low activity to about 10 times the activity that we had had before. And we were, frankly, run off our feet. In addition to my usual roles, I was a regular spokesperson in the media and was even meeting with more and more people in government. I think in that time, though, one of the most surreal experiences was when I got a phone call from somebody in the immigration department saying, you can expect an email from the Governor General's office later today. And that's how I ended up on a dais at Rideau Hall in Ottawa in front of a bunch of people, about this many people, talking about refugee resettlement. And I think for me, my soundbite of that event was when somebody asked, well, can refugees be settled in a small community? And I said, let me tell you about Altona, Manitoba. I'd been in Altona 3 months before that in September because they'd had a prayer meeting to talk about how they should be involved in this. It was more or less not when or if, but how. And so they decided to sponsor eventually 45 refugees, which was about 1% of the population of Altona. During that meeting, many people talked about how coming to Altona as refugees had changed their lives and how it was important to have this welcoming community. But the one significant story, which I told at Rideau Hall, was of Omar, who came to me after the event. And he said, my name is Omar. I'm from Sudan. I came from Sudan to Egypt and from Egypt to Altona. And then he paused for a moment and said, and my next stop is a cemetery because I'm not leaving. And he laughed heartily because he wanted to know that we knew that the cemetery was not a near thing in his future. But that was a moving story for people because it showed that these people who had come there had found a home. They had found a community, a place that had welcomed them. I began by telling you stories of what it was like to be here as a student. And as I was thinking about that this week, as I was preparing for this event, I thought about this in our community. And I came to realize that we, as students, were in some ways the outsiders. We were the Zens, if you will, because we were the temporary ones. And it was the faculty and the staff who were here year after year after year that were modeling this hospitality, this welcoming of the stranger, who was us. I think that's a sense that I've gotten today especially, is that is a part of CMU today, a place that reaches out, a place that welcomes the stranger, and is a great place for students to develop. Thank you.